Hello, this is Sandy again. This is Sandy's History, and today we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a plagiarist, a womanizer, maybe a megalomaniac, but I think he was also one of the greatest individuals in American history. He was, however, distinctly un-American. The American creed has always been a creed of rugged individualism, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, of competing and winning in a Darwinian struggle for material advantages. King's message was a radical critique of the American creed. People sometimes compare Martin Luther King to Booker T. Washington and Booker T. Washington's philosophy of accommodationism. Nothing, I think, could be further from the reality. King actively, aggressively confronted racial injustice and oppression wherever he saw it. He was arrested 29 times. He believed in provoking a crisis and forcing Americans to recognize the injustices in American society. And he did this through the radical philosophy of loving your enemies. King was born in 1929, the son of a Baptist minister in Atlanta, Georgia. He went to Morehouse College, to Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and got his doctorate from Boston University. After attending BU, he went to Montgomery, Alabama, where he was appointed to be the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It was then that the Montgomery Bus Boycott started. It started because of, as you probably know, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in a bus. She was arrested, and members of the community established a committee to boycott all of the buses in Montgomery. Martin Luther King became the leader, the spokesperson for this movement. He was chosen in large part because he was the new kid in town. He did not yet establish ties with the local leaders in the community. And if he failed, if the boycott failed, he could always move on to some other position. Nevertheless, he became very well known in Montgomery and throughout much of the United States for his leadership during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was during this time that he had a religious experience. I would like to read to you his description of what happened. He has been threatened with death threats over the telephone. His house was bombed. And he says he went down to his kitchen table one night and he sat there. He sat there and thought a beautiful little daughter, his daughter, who had just been born. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in night after night and see that little gentle smile. And I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken from me at any minute. And I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife, Coretta, who was over there asleep. And she could be taken from me. And I could be taken from her. And it got to the point where I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. Something said to me, "You can't call on Daddy now. He's up in Atlanta, 175 miles away. You can't even call on Mama now. You've got to call on that something in that person that your daddy used to tell you about, that power that can make a way out of no way." And I discovered then that religion had to become something real to me. And I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. I prayed a prayer. I prayed out loud that night. I said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. And I can't let the people see me like this. If they see me like this, weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." And then it happened. And it seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. I heard the voice of Jesus saying still to fight on. He promised never to leave me alone. Well, this was Martin Luther King's dark night of the soul and the epiphany that came to him. And I think this was one of the first in a series of events that increasingly radicalized Martin Luther King and led him on through his mission. As we know, the Montgomery Bus Boycott was ultimately successful. The Interstate Commerce Commission issued a ruling affirmed by the Supreme Court that segregation in busing was illegal and unconstitutional. Out of this Montgomery Bus Boycott movement, Martin Luther King established the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was his organization to combat racism and inequality in the South and ultimately throughout the nation. A few years later, one of the high points of the movement and King's campaign was the Birmingham Campaign in 1963, in which King and his organization launched a massive campaign of civil disobedience in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham was known as one of the most racist, most segregationist cities in America. It was known by some people because of the violence of the city as Bombingham. So it was in this situation that Martin Luther King went in, called for protest marches, sit-ins, attempts to register to vote, a whole host of activities that were designed to bring the city to a virtual halt. The philosophy behind this, the tactic behind this, was to have these protest marches get arrested, fill the jails, and not pay bail. This way the jails would fill up ultimately to their capacity and some kind of crisis would be reached. Weeks went on, and ultimately King and his associates saw that this was failing. Somebody made the decision, I think King ultimately went along with it, to call out the children in the local schools to come out and protest and to march. The city responded by sending out police with police dogs and firemen with fire hoses. To attack the children, and this made national headlines. During this time, King himself was arrested, and while he was in jail, he wrote which became known as the Letter from a Birmingham City Jail, which outlined his philosophy at the time and the status of the movement. I would like to read some of what he wrote in a letter from the Birmingham City Jail. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride for freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate. I think also he could have said the black moderates as well, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. In other words, it was the moderates who stood on the sidelines and agreed with the principles of the civil rights movement, but who didn't want to make waves, who didn't want to do anything, who could not put their faith into action. As we know, the Birmingham campaign was ultimately also a success, as the city leaders ultimately came to negotiate with King and his associates and established opportunities for jobs for African Americans and reduction of the segregationist policies in Birmingham. That same summer, Martin Luther King participated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was put together by many organizations and many people, But King ultimately became the figurehead of the movement at this time, in large part because of his famous "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
The March on Washington was one of the high points of the Civil Rights era. After this, John F. Kennedy died, Lyndon Johnson came into office, and this was actually an opportunity, as Lyndon Johnson saw it, after Kennedy's death, to pass some of the programs from the Progressive era, the New Deal era, that were still on the back burner of the liberal agenda. So Lyndon Johnson put together what he called his Great Society program, which included a war on poverty, and which led to the creation of Medicare and Medicaid. But more importantly for our purposes, those are very important obviously, but more importantly for our purposes, he was able to work with Martin Luther King and with other leaders of the civil rights movement in putting together a package of proposals, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which transformed the role of government in American society. The Civil Rights Act nullified state laws on segregation, declared it was within the powers of the federal government to ensure that integration of public facilities, entertainment facilities, hospitals, schools, was the law of the land. This was a massive expansion of federal powers, as many people in the South particularly were opposed to these actions and advocated for states' rights, which would become a calling card of conservatives ever since. The following year, 1965, Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act, which nullified all the voting restrictions, the disfranchisement that we talked about during the Gilded Age, that removed African American voters from the voting rolls. The poll tax, the literacy test, the grandfather clause, the whites-only primary, these were all now illegal according to federal law. A couple of things should be noted about this. One is that voter suppression is still very much with us. Particularly recently, conservatives have implemented in state legislatures requirements that voters have IDs identifying themselves when they vote. Oftentimes they've been moving polling places. They've been limiting the number of hours and places where people could vote, particularly targeting African American voters to be removed from the voter rolls. So the battle against voter suppression, the battle against disfranchisement continues. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major step forward. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should be noted as important because it ended de jure segregation. De jure, D-E space J-U-R-E, meaning segregation was approved, was allowed by law. We still have segregation today, but it's not de jure segregation. We have de facto segregation. So we still, oftentimes, African Americans and white Americans group together in schools and in churches. So we still have, I think, a ways to go, a long ways to go in ending some of these endemic problems in American society. The Selma Campaign was probably the high point of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King's involvement in it. There were 3 attempts to begin a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. The first one in 1965 led to what was called Bloody Sunday. Protesters walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma on their way to Montgomery and were met by mounted police with batons who beat the protesters until they were forced back across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A second attempt failed, and then a third attempt, Martin Luther King was able to lead a large contingent of people from Selma to Montgomery. At this point, many Hollywood celebrities came down to join the movement. It was a very celebratory atmosphere as Harry Belafonte, Tony Bennett, Peter, Paul, and Mary, many other people. Perhaps you're not familiar with all these names, but a lot of people from Hollywood, from the entertainment industry, came down in this very celebratory movement march from Selma to Montgomery. This was probably the high point of the civil rights movement. Things went downhill pretty quickly afterwards. King and civil rights leaders, I think, realized that the federal government had really gone as far as they could through legislation to address issues of racism in the South. And King now turned his attention to the North. He moved to Chicago, where he addressed issues of housing for blacks and for whites in the inner city in Chicago. He began to realize that racism in the South was only part of a much larger problem, that racism, poverty, violence were endemic in American society, and that a total revolution of American society would be necessary to transform America and end these problems. Now, people in the North who were all in favor of ending segregation in the South and were opposed to Southern racism were not quite so eager to support Martin Luther King's movement to the North and address issues of poverty in the North. He began to increasingly lose support, first from his addressing poverty in the North, and secondly when he came out in opposition to Lyndon Johnson's war in Vietnam. This was a transforming moment for both Martin Luther King and for President Johnson. Martin Luther King, increasingly criticized by people who had formerly supported him, moved on to new visions about how to transform American society. Lyndon Johnson, I think, ultimately realized that his policies in Vietnam were a failure and decided not to run for re-election in 1968. In 1968, a critical year in American history, it was also the year in which Martin Luther King was assassinated, and the civil rights movement declined afterwards. King, in his final months, tried to organize a Poor People's Campaign, another march on Washington. And I think this was really King's attempt to push America over into a new era of peace and justice and racial harmony. I think and a totally idealistic vision of American society. In 1968, Martin Luther King went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a sanitation workers' strike. And on April 3rd, of 1968, he gave a speech which has become known as the mountaintop speech. I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I've looked over the mountain and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the coming of the Lord. This was April 3rd, 1968. The following day, April 4th, 1968, he was shot and killed. This pretty much ended the civil rights movement, not just because of King's death, but there were a whole host of other events that were happening in 1968, including the death of Robert F. Kennedy, who might have been President of the United States, and continued the liberal reforms of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson. But he was assassinated as well. Ultimately, Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 to be President of the United States and established the beginning of a conservative era in American history that in many cases was opposed to the reforms of the civil rights movement and the other reforms during the liberal period of the 1960s. King's strategy in all of this was to create a crisis that would force national attention upon these issues and then bring the power of the federal government to bear. It was a very savvy strategy, but it also had very deep idealistic theological roots. King believed that America's problem was not just a racial problem. He worked, he said, not just for the improvement of black rights, but for social justice for blacks and for whites. He believed that a just society would benefit not just the oppressed, but all members of society. His message was that we must break the cycle of racism, of poverty, of violence, that these fit together to create a much larger social problem that can only be confronted through a radical transformation of society. His philosophy of nonviolent passive resistance was not a philosophy of acquiescence. It was not a philosophy of accommodation. And it required something I think was very un-American, which goes against the core of who we are as Americans. It demanded us to accept the nobility of suffering, that there was something valuable in suffering, in accepting the pains of following your beliefs. And it was a message, I think, that we can still learn from and perhaps in some day realize in American society. In future videos, we will look at the rise of the Black Power movement and Malcolm X. So thank you for watching.